Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our Black History Month keynote event with Dr. Angela Davis. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are so very excited to have the renowned Dr. Davis with us tonight. My name is Priscilla Collier, and I'm the president of Black Student Union at UTSA. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. Black History Month is an annual celebration of achievement by Black Americans and a time for recognizing their contribution to our university, our city, our state, and our nation. This year at UTSA, there are over 15 events held in honor of Black History Month with a theme of Mattering is the Minimum. These events varied from Racial Justice Book Club to Black Hair in Corporate America to Afro Beats, and reminding us of how important it is to honor and recognize the contribution and achievements of the Black community on the entire UTSA community and beyond. These celebrations focused on topics ranging from the Black Lives Movement, Black Love Matters, Black Education Matters, Black Health Education, Black Culture Matters, Black Stories Matter, Black History Matters, and so much more as we focus on amplifying the voices of the Black community. Before we begin, I would like to share a few announcements. This program is sponsored by the Office of Student Activities and the Student Union as part of UTSA Black History Month. The program will be moderated by Dr. Kelly Nash. We will start with a moderated discussion followed by an opportunity for you all to submit questions via the live chat feature in Zoom to Dr. Davis. You'll notice that this event is in webinar format. You can submit a question from the Q&A portion of the program by clicking on the Q&A button in your Zoom window. We may not get to every question, and it's possible that the question will be answered at another portion of the program. We have enabled the live transcript feature within Zoom from this webinar. For individuals who wish to utilize this feature, please click Show Subtitles from the live transcript option in your Zoom window. Now, to begin our program, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Sherry Simmons Horton, the UTSA Assistant Professor in Social Work, and Dr. Kelly Nash, the UTSA Professor and Associate and Dean for Faculty Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Okoli. Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Sherry Simmons Horton, Assistant Professor in the Graduate Department of Social Work at UTSA. I'm privileged with the opportunity to introduce to you our UTSA Black History Month speaker, the esteemed Dr. Angela Davis. Dr. Davis is one of the most highly recognized intellectual visionaries in the world. Her unyielding audacity in the freedom movement has been at the expense of her own freedom. Early in her career as an assistant professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, Dr. Davis was stripped from her academic appointment at the urging of then Governor Ronald Reagan because of her membership with the Communist Party. Dr. Davis was the third female to be placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list in 1970 4 days following issuance of an arrest warrant for crimes which she was acquitted for in 1972. The notable court trial is part of our cultural history and remains a testament to her staunch dedication to the human rights movement. Despite pronouncement in the 1970s that Dr. Davis would never teach again in the University of California system, she has since taught at the San Francisco State University, Mills College, and the University of California, Berkeley. She received the distinguished honor of being appointed to the University of California Presidential Chair in African American and Feminist Studies in 1994. In the last 2 years, she has been inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. Dr. Davis is one of the most prolific leaders for civil and human rights for multiple generations. A renowned author and cultural icon, Dr. Davis is recognized around the world as a powerful instrument of social change and a voice for racial and gender equality. Her literary works include numerous books and essays, including Are Prisons Obsolete? And Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement, which is also the name of this keynote tonight. Dr. Davis's life and professional experiences are a model for abolition activism today as she continues to model the importance of solidarity and radical intersectional analysis for social change around the world. Each of us in this space are anxious to hear and learn from this phenomenal social justice warrior. Dr. Davis, on behalf of the University of Texas at San Antonio, we welcome you. And with that, I will turn the conversation over to our moderator, Dr. Kelly Nash.
Thank you, Dr. Sims Horton, and welcome, Dr. Davis. We are ecstatic to have you here this evening and really looking forward to the conversation tonight. I'll begin. I know our audience is anxious to share questions, and I'll encourage them to go ahead and start sharing questions through the Q&A feature. Again, we may answer your question during the course of the first part of our conversation, so just kind of be patient with us and bear with us. So let's start with our first question, Dr. Davis. The idea of freedom is inspiring, but what does it mean? What is your vision of freedom, and how might this freedom be realized?
Well, thank you very much. And I would first like to say thank you for inviting me to participate in your Black History Month celebration. And I know that you're experiencing very difficult times in Texas and in San Antonio. So, let me express my solidarity with you as you attempt to address a whole range of interconnected issues, including climate change and the catastrophe that you're currently experiencing. Freedom seems like a simple concept. And I read a book by Orlando Patterson called Slavery and Social Death some years ago. I've read it a couple of times. I've taught it as well. And in that study of slavery, he argues that the concept that we know as freedom, connected with Western notions of democracy and rights, can probably be traced to the yearnings of an enslaved person who was yearning to be free. So his argument is that the whole Western notion of freedom more than likely has its origins in the unfreedom of people who have been enslaved. I like the concept of freedom because it can't be defined in a straightforward way. And my own sense of freedom has expanded and become more capacious as time has passed, as I've been involved in various struggles, and as I've witnessed that in the very process of struggling for freedom, one becomes aware of dimensions that one has not yet addressed. I like a comment that Toni Morrison made in a a commencement address. I think it was for Barnard College many years ago. And she said, freedom is about freeing someone else. That freedom cannot be contained within a paradigm that is individualistic. One cannot be free alone. Freedom is collective. Freedom is about transforming conditions so that communities might be able to live lives that are in more habitable conditions, I would say. So yeah, there's so much I could say in response to this question. We could actually fill up the entire time allotted for this conversation. But let me just point out something that I've said many times. When I became involved in the Black liberation movement in Southern California in the latter 1960s, I remember that our slogan was "Free the Black Man." And even though there were more women than men participating in the struggle, we were calling for freedom for the Black man. And it took a while before we were able to incorporate gender into our vision of freedom and recognize that we have not even been writing ourselves into the script of freedom. So that just as we moved from race to gender, we have to include sexuality, we have to include nation, we have to include a whole range of issues in order to accommodate a constantly transforming and growing notion of the meaning of freedom.
Thank you for that amazing insight. I want to pick up on one of those themes you talked about when you first became active in the Black liberation movement. And so we have a very broad audience here tonight, and for them, how would you define anti-Blackness, and how has that impacted your activism over the years?
Well, I grew up in a segregated community. I grew up in the most segregated city in the United States of America at that time, in Birmingham, Alabama. And everything was literally segregated. Education, of course, was segregated, housing, neighborhoods, everything. So I really grew up in an all Black community. And although I was very frustrated because of the fact that there was so much that I had no access to, but at the same time, I learned the meaning of community. I learned for example, how to sing, lift every voice and sing. And in my mind, every time we sang the Star Spangled Banner, we also sang the Black National Anthem, what we then called the Negro National Anthem. But what I want to point out in response to your question is that over time, I came to recognize the degree to which anti-Black racism is linked to other racisms, especially anti-Indigenous racism, and anti-Latinx racisms, and that we can't really imagine white supremacy as only focusing on Black communities. And I also like to think about the fact that when we speak about the racist foundations of the history of this country, we're referring not only to slavery, but also to colonialism, to the original racism of this country. And so I like to be specific about the forms of racism that various communities experience, but at the same time, I like always to think them together, because we will never be able to extricate ourselves from anti-Black racism if we don't also address the racism directed against indigenous people and Latinx communities and Islamophobia and the anti-Asian racisms, which have experienced such a surge as a result of the actions of what's his name, the last person to occupy the office of the presidency. I don't like to call his name because I've learned that naming can be very powerful. And so I try to refuse, sometimes I slip, I try to refuse to utter his name in public context like this.
Well, I appreciate that. And I really like this theme of, thinking about all the various, communities and ethnicities that are impacted, right, by this, the anti sentiments. And so in the history of this country. And so you've been in academia, throughout your career. And so from your perspective, what does ethnic studies or social justice programming and education look like if educators get it right?
Okay, but before I move on to that question, let me just add another element to the question you just posed, which I think is really important, and that is the international dimension. We oftentimes think of racism as a domestic issue, and we fail to recognize that the entire planet has been polluted by racism. Colonialism and slavery as the founding racisms of this era affected not only the Americas, of course, not only North America, the US and Canada, and not only South America. Brazil, of course, is the country that has the largest numbers of Black people of any other country aside from the continent of Africa. And we can witness the ways in which the structural racism associated with policing and imprisonment in a Brazilian context. And at the same time, we look at the problems of associated with the kinds of waves of immigration that have been occasioned by global capitalism, and that is connected to racism. So I want us to have a very capacious view of what counts as racism that also leads us to seek solidarities with people outside of the national borders of this country. And okay, it's in that context that I'll try to respond to the question that you posed about ethnic studies. And I thought to talk about the international dimension when you mentioned ethnic studies, because at San Francisco State University, which was the first university to create an ethnic studies program in 1968 as a consequence of the student strike that took place on that campus. The original name of the field was not ethnic studies, it was third world studies. And it was designed to not only address the issues confronting people of color in this country, but also in the global South. And we might understand why that appeared to be a bit too radical because of the connotations of revolution and so forth. And the term, the ethnic studies was actually a compromise. But I think that the field, as it has evolved, and some people refer to the field as critical ethnic studies. There's a journal and a series of conferences that append the critical to the name of ethnic studies. The relationship of ethnic studies to social justice work captures, it seems to me, the very meaning of education. Knowledge should always be transformative, whether it is knowledge in the sciences or the social sciences or the humanities or the art. If it is valuable, it should have an impact on our worlds, and it should assist us in transforming conditions that militate against freedom and justice and equality. And so that is how I think about ethnic studies. I'm someone who taught in the ethnic studies program at San Francisco State for many years. And another concept that I think is central is that of interdisciplinarity. And of course, like Black studies, like feminist studies, like Latinx studies, the field is an interdisciplinary field. It is not grounded in a single or even several disciplines. But I want us to think about interdisciplinarity more broadly and recognize that knowledge gets produced in venues other than the university, and that we can benefit from acknowledging the knowledge that is produced within social movements, the knowledge that is produced inside prisons. As a matter of fact, there is a field that we call critical prison studies that counts on, or that rest on the foundational concepts that were actually produced by people in prison. So that sense of the breadth of knowledge and the relationship of knowledge to radical social transformation is what characterizes ethnic studies and social justice program at their best, I think.
Great, wonderful. I appreciate that perspective, and that, some of what you shared was, very new to me, particularly around the prison side of, but I will, let me pick up on that theme of the social justice programming. I know we have a lot of students on the webinar tonight, and around our campus, we've been having lots of community conversations in the last year, and overwhelmingly, hearing from young people about, staying optimistic. And so I want to ask you if you could share with the audience here, how do you stay optimistic in this complex world, and how do you maintain your conviction? What approaches do you use?
Well, first of all, thanks to growing up, as I mentioned before, in a context which required us to imagine ourselves as a community rather than as simply individuals. We knew that if we were ever going to advance in the struggle against racism, it would not be as individuals, it would be as a larger community. And so I always remind myself that I do not approach this work as an individual, and that there's nothing particularly significant that I could ever accomplish as an individual alone. Even when I participate in practices that are relatively solitary, writing, for example, I'm constantly interrogating, at least in my mind, the members of my community. And I'm recognizing that I draw a sustenance and support from communities, and that the ideas that I try to produce are not my ideas alone. They're not ideas that emerge from the context of individual reflection. They're ideas that have been produced in the course of collective struggle. And so this helps me remain optimistic because I know that I'm not the only one here. that as a matter of fact, I really don't matter that much, given the large expanse of people who have been involved in these amazing struggles against racism and heteropatriarchy and for environmental justice. So I find my courage, my sustenance from knowing that I'm simply one out of many, and that if I falter, or if I get tired, or if I need to take some time out, it's not going to have an impact on the goal, because there are others who will continue the work. So I think that internalizing this sense of fundamentally being a member of a larger community rather than an isolated individual has helped me remain optimistic and helped me to maintain my convictions, which after all are collective convictions.
Wonderful. I mean, I love this idea that we are, this is a community effort, right? And so I do want to kind of switch gears a little bit and touch back on something you mentioned earlier about women, particularly in the movement. And so can you discuss the role of radical women of color in the movement? The building of the movement, as well as describing the challenges that they face and maybe some of the challenges you see, as we continue this work in the future.
Well, oops, excuse me.
That's okay.
Maybe that was all of the women of color
They were
speaking to us. And asking us to acknowledge that the primary work of building movements has been the work of women of color. And I'm thinking about our most recent election. Who was it that brought out, all of the people who voted in unprecedented numbers, and who helped to shift the balance of power in the Senate? I mean, it was Black women, and I'm thinking very specifically, of course, of women like Stacey Abrams and LaTosha Brown, but so many others whose names we do not know. Who was responsible for the Montgomery bus boycott? It was not only Rosa Parks, who incidentally did a great deal more than refuse to move to the back of the bus. She was a trained, skilled organizer who had many, many years of organizing already behind her when she took that stance in Montgomery in 1955. So yeah, many people aren't even aware of the fact that the majority of the members of the Black Panther Party were women. Because who do they think about? They think about Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and of course Huey and Bobby were amazing and did incredible work. But the part that Black women and women of color have played going back to the 19th century has rarely been recognized. We're just now beginning to see the development of an archive that reflects the intellectual and activist labor of Black women and women of color. So yeah, I also want to point out that when we talk about Black struggles, this is Black History Month and we're talking about Black history, it's important to recognize that it was not only Black people who participated in Black liberation movements. And I'm thinking, for example, about Elizabeth Batista Martinez, whom I've known for many, many, many years. And she worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the South before she became a key figure in the emergence of the Chicano movement. we sometimes act as if all of these concepts are discrete and disconnected, and that we can approach them that way. And that's unfortunately one of the mistakes that we as academics often make, because certainly we do isolate concepts and notions in order to engage with them analytically. But we, at the same time, have to recognize that this is not the nature of social reality. You know, this is why we had to call for what eventually came to be known as intersectionality, because we found ourselves in situations where the connection between struggles for women's equality and freedom were not, and women of all racial and ethnic backgrounds were not related to the struggles against racism. And so even though we have a whole history of the ways in which white feminists acquired a sense of their own oppression from participating in anti-slavery movements. Then we have to try to put it all back together again after we thought about these issues as completely separate. You know, I often point out that I can remember people asking me back in, I guess it was the 70s, well, what are you anyway? Are you Black or are you a woman? and of course, that's an absurd question, but it gives us a sense of the role that ideology plays in preventing us from apprehending the very nature of social, economic, and political reality.
Wonderful. I mean, I think our young folks in the audience tonight can gain a lot of insight from you know, what you shared with us. You know, I completely concur. I'm a physicist, so I know, you know, women of color have been, you know, sidelined, and so, but, you know, pushing forward on that kind of the movement, and, you know, a lot of women of color are doing that work in various academic disciplines. So truly appreciate that.
And also, let's acknowledge the fact that in this contemporary era of social justice struggles, finally, women are in the leadership, and that they're not only in the leadership of formations within Black Lives Matter, for example, in Latinx movements, but they've come up with new paradigms of leadership, because, you know, it used to be that when you wanted to know, you wanted to get information about a movement, you asked who was the leader, and the leader would be a charismatic male figure, right? And nowadays that question is asked, and the response is that our leadership is collective. And this is something that was insisted upon by Ella Baker during the what we call the civil rights era, who decided that she wanted to affiliate herself with the younger folks and with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as opposed to Martin Luther King's organization of ministers. And of course, within that context, it was not only a Black male charismatic figure, but he also had to be a minister on top of that. And she called for collective leadership. And she said that we, you know, we have so much talent that we don't have to worry about leaders. What we have to worry about is doing the organizing and bringing people together, and leaders will emerge. And we've seen that happen in this contemporary era.
Yes, I completely agree. And yeah, you can look at all the movements that are happening, and that's what we are seeing, this kind of return to this collective movement. I want to switch a little bit to some of the work that you've written, and in particular in your book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. You wrote, progressive struggles are doomed to fail if they do not attempt to develop a consciousness of the insidious promotion of capitalistic individualism. What would you share with the movement builders in the audience, even today, in their effort to chip away at the individualism to advance more of a just world?
Yeah, that's a really major issue. And considering the ways in which capitalist ideology, and particularly in this neoliberal era, neoliberal ideologies define the basic unit of society as the individual. And not just the individual, but the individual on the capitalist market trying to make profit. So that is the paradigm that we are challenging. And we internalize these ideas to the extent that we actually often think that these are our own original ideas. But in the process of embracing these ideas, we are actually doing the work of the state. We are doing the work of white supremacy. And so this is actually an issue that has become much more apparent in contemporary times, the relationship between our emotional life and our involvement in movements. And let me say that as someone who's worked for many, many years against the prison industrial complex and for abolition, we've recognized that we not only have to ask people to try to imagine different ways of addressing the issues that prisons and police cannot address, but we also have to think about the ways in which we have been deeply affected by these institutions and the ways in which we often internalize the impulses, the ideological impulses of these institutions. So that, for example, we say that we don't want punitive justice, we don't want retributive justice, we want something better, we want transformative justice, we want restorative justice. But then we find ourselves in a situation where we feel that we've been harmed by someone, and our immediate impulse is to harm that person back. So you see, we have to learn how to recognize those emotions as the product of ideology and figure out, how to begin the process of contesting them. So it's a constant struggle.
I want to build a little bit on that theme, about the capitalist individualism. If we think about the impacts, or as you think about the impacts of the pandemic on Black and African American individuals, and any marginalized communities. And those with a college degree are facing higher unemployment rates than white individuals with no degree. What do you feel is the role of employers, play in building a more just and inclusive and accessible workplace, given that we have a lot of young people who will be, graduating with degrees and going into the workforce?
Right. And I think it's very important that our current public discourse on structural racism is a product of acknowledging the disparate impact of the pandemic on Black people, on Indigenous people, other people of color. And that actually helped to create a kind of historical conjuncture, which has led to the recognition that we have to begin to look at the ways in which institutions incorporate structural racism, so that you can't simply talk about diversity and inclusion. I mean, I know DEI, diversity,
equity and
equity
inclusion.
and inclusion. You
Mhm.
got to go a bit further than that, because the assumption is always that the institution itself is fine. What we have to do is bring those who were previously marginalized into the institution, into the academic institution, for example, into the corporation, and I do a lot of work in the jazz community, which also suffers that kind of structural racism. But when you simply argue for diversity, inclusion, and even equity, you're not looking at the reasons why you need these kinds of strategies. You're not looking at the role the institution itself has played in reproducing structural racism. So I like diversity and inclusion, but I think justice, I guess equity is kind of, no, equity doesn't quite mean justice. So let me take that back. I think justice is something vaster and something that's far more complicated. And we face the difficulties of imagining a long trajectory for the solution of these problems. We've again incorporated capitalist impulses that are always about what the outcome is and what the outcome is in the short term. As a matter of fact, if you write grants and so forth, they always ask you, what is the 1-year outcome? What is the 5-year outcome? But we're talking about a process that is going to take a very long time, that you can't boil down to an instantaneous solution. So that in answer to your question, I think what our role is today is to create the kind of terrain that will encourage constant struggles over time, designed to identify and extricate these structures that render racism so permanent. And I've said so many times that this is something that should have begun in the immediate aftermath of the formal abolition of slavery. It should have happened at the end of the 19th century, but it didn't. And finally, we recognize that it needs to happen. So we also have to commit ourselves to a protracted struggle, and the institutions that are attempting to address structural racism have to plot a path that is going to be a very long one, that is not going to lead to success in 1 year or even 5 years.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I think I've heard a lot of conversations around, that difference between equity and justice. And I like how you frame this. And I would completely agree with you. I think we, with the abolitionist movement, it was more about, kind of equity. And seems like we're trying, that pathway is that we should be developing, a path for justice. And so truly appreciate those words of inspiration and wisdom.
And I was just thinking, after I end my question, I always think of something that would have been illuminating. But equity usually requires a measure. And the measure of equity is usually white, is usually male. And what I want to suggest is that we need to create different measures. It seems to me that the measure of equality and freedom should be those who have participated in freedom struggles for all of these centuries, and not some white man who could take his privilege for granted. So I think if we use the term equity, we have to extricate it from the notion of whiteness as norm and maleness.
Maleness. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm going to switch gears here and take some questions from the audience, Dr. Davis. I know we have tons of questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to start off with a question from Priscilla. Priscilla is one of our students, and she says, as an activist, many people look up to you. Do you have any contemporary activists that you admire? If so, who are they and why?
Oh yeah, I have a lot of contemporary activists that I admire. As a matter of fact, I think I get my inspiration in my elder years from those who are younger than I am. And I try to learn from younger people. I just did a webinar yesterday with Patrice Cullors and Michelle Alexander, and we were speaking at the Ohio State University together, and it was really wonderful listening to them. I always find them inspiring, especially Patrice and Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi. I'm actually on the advisory board of an organization in Florida, the Dream Defenders, which was one of the first organizations to respond to the killing of Trayvon Martin back in 2012. And I have learned so much from young people. And I think that I'm still, I consider myself a part of a community that is led by young people. So I position myself as a follower during this era, because I'm having to unlearn so much of what I've done, over time. And I've, had to learn new vocabularies, new ways of expressing gender, the relationship of trans women, especially Black trans women, the questions of sexuality and the notion of sexuality as incorporating yearnings for freedom that goes all the way back to slavery. I've learned a lot, and I should tell you that when I was young, in my 20s, I think, and I was definitely in my 20s, and I was a member of the Communist Party. I was a member of the Black Panther Party, and did work with other organizations as well. I remember being really impressed by older people who, especially within the Communist Party, because there were older people who had been active during the 1930s, as my mother was, by the way. She was active in a group that was created by Black communists. And I remember that, some of the older people really didn't want to be bothered with those of us who were younger, because they figured they knew everything. But then there were others who approached us on an egalitarian basis, and not only lectured to us about what we should be doing, but asked us for our opinions and what we thought about this organizing project, and what direction should we be moving in. And so I made a promise to myself when I was very young that I would try to be that second type of older person, that when I got older, I wouldn't forget what it was like to be young, and I wouldn't assume that I was the one who was in possession of all of the relevant knowledge. So I constantly check in with myself to make sure, because we all have proclivities that lead us in the wrong direction, and I notice that I catch that in myself all the time.
We have to remain hip, right? So good. Well, we have another question from Kai, and who's in the audience. And Kai wants to know, how do you continue to move through grief while organizing? Any advice on finding a space for grief, balancing community care and self-care?
Yeah, and this is again a question that would probably not have had an answer during earlier periods, because yeah, as revolutionaries, we were just supposed to suck up and do the work and not bring our personal, questions into the space of the organizing for revolution. And now we have a much more holistic approach, thanks to the work of young organizers who recognize that all of us have experienced trauma, either directly or indirectly, and 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 that we should all be given a space to mourn that which we have lost, uh, uh, and that it should happen collectively. Oftentimes in the past, we assumed that that was an individual issue. So, if you need to express your grief, go home and do it, go cry or whatever. But younger activists have really emphasized the importance of creating collective spaces for self-care and to allow us to engage collectively with these traumas and collectively with our needs as individuals. And I just want to point out that such an approach really encourages individuality. And I sometimes have to point out that my critique of individualism is not a critique of individuality. As a matter of fact, and this is again an issue that arises because of the particular ideologies to which we've been subject, that we think that that if we are opposed to individualism, we want everybody to be the same. No, I think it's only in the context of criticizing the kind of capitalist individualism that our individuality can flourish, and that individuality definitely involves dimensions of trauma and the need to express grief within collective contexts.
Thank you for that. I want to ask you about, we have a question from Carla, who's in the audience. And so this is a little bit about recent events that have happened at the Capitol. And so how do you see the difference between the January 6th radical event at the Capitol and those declared radicals with that of the Black Panther Party?
What is the difference?
Yes. How do you see the difference between those that participated in the January 6th event with that of the Black Panther Party?
Yeah, I don't even know whether I would formulate the question in that way, because there's no point of comparison. And as a matter of fact, I really resent the use of the term radical to describe terrorists and to describe white supremacists. I think it's a misnomer because radical, the meaning of radical is root. The etymological meaning is root, and it is about understanding, apprehending conditions at their root rather than on the surface. And so this, white supremacists don't have anything to do with radicalism, although I acknowledge that this is the popular term that is being used. But I just want to urge us to reflect on the ways in which the struggles of progressive and radical activists who want to see an end to suffering and misery and exploitation and racism and heteropatriarchy, that those those struggles are incorrectly linked to white supremacists in order to undermine the work that people who are struggling for more habitable futures are doing. So having said that, I'll say that first of all, we should have seen that coming because 45 basically called upon all of these white supremacist groups to accompany him in this process of trying to overturn the minimal degree of democracy that we have. So these are people who want to turn the clock back, who refuse to recognize the flow of history, who, like 45, assume that that the past is where we will discover greatness, the past of racism, the past of exploitation, the past of militarism. And organizers in groups like the Black Panther Party and Black Lives Matter formations are looking forward, are looking toward the future. So you have a clash between the past and the future. That is really, in my opinion, what distinguishes the two formations. And of course, we can't go back to the past. That's not even possible. But they seek their sense of comfort in a past that was based on exploitation and racism and white privilege. That is where they want to go. And those of us who are calling for a new future, and we're doing it even on behalf of those white people who don't even recognize that they ought to be standing with us, particularly the ones who are so impoverished as a result of deindustrialization and the processes of global capitalism. They have argued, according to 45, that it's the immigrants who are the problem. It's Black people who are the problem. It's what, those countries that he called S-hole countries. So yeah, let me stop now. But
Thank
be
you.
careful about your comparisons.
About our comparisons. Thank you. We appreciate that. Sarah wants to know, how should we think about balancing freedom of expression, especially for people with marginalized perspectives, with safety, especially for those people in those marginalized communities?
I think my answer would probably be the same answer that I offer to all kinds of questions regarding organizing and taking radical stances and speaking out. And that is community. Oftentimes when we think about, say, freedom of speech, we imagine it as the freedom of speech of an individual. And we don't necessarily think about the larger community. And particularly in the academic world, the first thing we should think about is building community. So that we have protection for our ideas and for our proclivities to engage in social justice struggles, so that if the administration attempts to attack one person, it will have to deal with an entire community. It will have to deal with 100 or 500. And especially for women of color who are academics, who are professors, and community is the very first thing that we need to build so that we don't find ourselves out there alone. I'm thinking about Lordia Pena Garcia, who was denied tenure at Harvard. And this is a brilliant woman who's done all of this incredible work. But because of the fact that her work is related to social justice struggles and to the bringing of Black and Latinx communities together, she writes about the Dominican Republic and Dominicans within the U.S. and the connections, the connections of social justice struggles. And she was denied tenure, but there was a huge response. And even if she doesn't get to stay at Harvard, she has a community that is nurturing her and that will hopefully help to rescue her career and her ideas and her commitments.
Oh, wonderful. And I think, and we actually had a audience member that was, we're inquiring about, what advice did you have for junior faculty? And I think, this idea of community really speaks to that, right? Building that community is important. We have a few more questions and time for a few more questions. We have Tanisha asked, do you think social media is helping or hurting our ability to move forward as a society, which is more, moving forward as a society which is more just?
Well, that's a question for which there may not be a straightforward answer. But I do think that that we need to recognize these new technologies of communication as what we have today. This is a part of our environment, and my advice is always that we try to make productive use of those technologies rather than allowing the technologies to use us. So oftentimes we think that, that all we have to do is put something on social media and we're doing the organizing work. But organizing is an art, it's a skill. It requires critical engagement. It requires, conversations and struggles. And some of this can happen online, but not all of it can happen online. And don't expect the online aspect of it to do the work that has to be done in order to consolidate communities of struggle. I always point out that when I was a young activist and we wanted to organize national student strikes, for example, we couldn't even use the telephone because it was too expensive to make long distance calls. And we had to therefore do a lot of our organizing by snail mail. And we actually did organize a major national student strike during the Vietnam War era in the spring, I think it was the spring of 1970 when Nixon invaded Cambodia. And now I mentioned that internationalism is so important that we have to go further than the borders of this country. I think I was I was referring to the fact that that we have to be really capacious in our sense of the impact of racism and those who have been affected by colonialism and slavery and all of the forms of racism spawned by those institutions, and that this is the case all over the world. So how do we work together with people in Brazil who face racist police violence to an even greater extent than we do here? Well, we can use social media for that work. I've learned a lot during this pandemic because I've been able to participate in webinars that involve people from other countries around Palestine, for example, discussing the importance of generating solidarity for Palestine. And that connection between Black struggles in the US and struggles against occupied Palestine occurred precisely as a consequence of social media. Because in relation to the Ferguson uprisings, Palestinian activists recognized that the same tear gas that was used against Palestinians by the Israeli government was used in Ferguson, Missouri, because they saw images of the actual canisters. And therefore, they were able to offer advice to the Ferguson protesters with respect to how to protect themselves. And that's, I think, such a marvelous example of what has been enabled by the emergence of these technologies. But we have to make sure that we are utilizing the technologies to accomplish goals that don't necessarily connect to the goals of the technologies considered by themselves and considered as a capitalist commodity.
Oh, wonderful. And I think that addresses a lot of questions we have in the Q&A from many of the folks in our audience are asking how can young people be involved? And I know social media is one of these platforms that our young folks are using as their entry into, activism. And so I think, what you share with us speaks volumes about, doing the hard work, right? Yes. And balancing that with the social media. I think we have time for one more question. And we're just going to close out. And this is from Alexander, and I'm combining this with a couple of questions from Ashley as well. So Alexander and Ashley want to know, what is one of the biggest positive changes you've seen in your lifetime? And what gives you hope for the future? And maybe you want to share a little bit about what you think your legacy will be in the future.
Well, what are the major changes I've seen? Well, I've seen a lot of changes. As I said, my childhood was spent in segregation, and I was able to attend high school in New York, where I became involved in a communist youth group. Because of the connection that my parents had with Black communists who were working in the South. And so, I've seen so many remarkable changes. Excuse me, although we have still not achieved the goals we set out to achieve. And the reason I say that I've seen remarkable changes is because I think we have to claim our victories. And if we don't point to changes that have happened as a direct consequence of the kind of activist work, then why should we do the organizing? Why should we engage in these struggles? So I went to college at Brandeis University. And at the time, there were maybe about 5 or 6 other Black students on the entire campus. And so it was really a breath of fresh air to go back recently to actually observe the anniversary of the takeover of a building in connection with Black demands back in the 70s, I think, or late 60s or early 70s. So it used to be that if you went to a predominantly white institution, it was practically all white. And so I know that we should have many more Black students and students of color on these campuses. But we do have many more than we could have imagined during that early period. As someone who's been an abolitionist for a very long time, I never imagined that I would experience a moment when abolition would enter into public discourse. And so I'm just so excited, sitting at my house as a result of the pandemic, witnessing, not only all of the amazing demonstrations that happened last summer, but also looking at the ways in which so many people have contributed to this new public discourse on abolition. There's a book that Mariam Kaba just wrote on abolition, and it's really amazing. And I just watched a YouTube channel, Patrice Cullors' YouTube channel, which is about what it means to be an abolitionist. This is absolutely amazing to me because I can remember when the few of us who did identify as abolitionists were called idealists who had no sense of what was possible in the world, and who were told that we were out of our minds if we thought that institutions like the prison or the police could be abolished. And to me, that's a victory. And let me say that even though we have not been able to successfully dismantle the structures and institutions and systems of racism, we have developed a vocabulary, we have developed analytical frameworks, popular analytical frameworks that allow us to more profoundly understand the work that we are doing. Before we talked about working against racism, and almost inevitably, the figure on behalf of whom we were working was the Black man. And now we not only think about Black women as playing a central role, but we recognize that the gender binary itself cannot contain the ways in which people identify, and that the absolutely phenomenal work of trans organizers, especially Black trans women of color, have that work has made it possible for us to imagine overturning other ideological structures and other anchors of our sense of what counts as normal. So I'm really excited about this period, and I'm just so happy that I'm able to witness this moment, and I see myself as witnessing this moment not only for myself, but on behalf of all of my comrades and sisters and brothers who have fallen in the process of the struggle.
Amazing. Well, we have run out of time for this evening's conversation. We had a ton of questions in the Q&A, and unfortunately we can't hold you all night, Dr. Davis. But we, on behalf of the UTSA community and our guests from the broader San Antonio community that have joined us tonight, we want to thank you for being our speaker tonight. And we are extremely, extremely grateful for this insightful conversation that you've given us tonight that is going to help us continue to do the work that we are doing at UTSA. And so I'm going to turn it over to Priscilla, and she is going to help us finish out the rest of the program. But thank you again, Dr. Davis.
Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Dr. Davis. Before we close out this event, I would like to redirect your attention to Dr. Jackie Cuevas to give us a little information on the Democratizing Radical Justice DRJ grant.
Thank you, Priscilla. And thank you, Dr. Davis. That was truly invigorating, as always. I'm Jackie Cuevas. I have a brief announcement about this new project. It's a Democratizing Racial Justice. It's a collaboration between the UTSA Women's Studies Institute, the Department of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, or REGS, Alamo Community Colleges, and the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. We will be gathering groups of community members, organizers, artists, students, faculty, and staff, and special guests to create shared visions for racial justice. We'll be hosting workshops, dialogue sessions, and various other public events, and the groups will get together and share their ideas with the broader community. The Mellon Foundation, directed by Dr. Elizabeth Alexander, has awarded us a $5 million grant to support this work over the next 3 years. We envision this as one of the many ways that we can put the university to work on behalf of our communities. Other faculty involved in the project so far include Alejandra Elenes, Rhonda Gonzalez, Carla Broaddus, Liliana Saldana, and Sandra Garza. We have invited Dr. Davis and also Chandra Talbale Mohante and many other amazing thinkers to speak to the DRJ Justice Group in the future. And we're very excited about the opportunity to learn from them in the future, to think together about how do we address racial justice issues in San Antonio. Once we have the details for those events, we will announce them later this year. So please follow the Women's Studies Institute and REGS on social media for how to get involved. And thank you again, Priscilla, and thank you, Dr. Davis.
Thank you, Dr. Cuevas. This is such an exciting time for UTSA. I know I speak for many students when I say that we are definitely looking forward to this new program. And that concludes our program for this evening. It was so exciting to see UTSA and San Antonio community together for this amazing opportunity to hear Dr. Davis talk. Have a great evening, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you all at the rest of our Black History Month events. Thank you again.